Good afternoon, everybody. Bienvenue a tout le monde, tous et toutes qui se joignent à nous cet après-midi. Bienvenidos a todos los que nos acompañan esta tarde. Mi nombre es Viviana Fernández, soy directora asociada del Centro de Derechos Humanos de la Universidad de Ottawa. Je suis Viviana Fernández, directrice associée du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement sur les droits de la personne de l'Université d'Ottawa. And in English, Viviana Fernandez here, Associate Director at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. On behalf of the Center and our Scholars at Risk U Ottawa program, as well as our partners in the SAR Scholars at Risk Canada section, we are delighted to present a series of 2 webinars titled International Tools to Advance Academic Freedom. This activity was conceived to mark the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Scholars at Risk network. The University of Ottawa joined the SAR network in 2014, and the Canadian section was created in 2012 at the University of Toronto with a ceremony. Since then, our center has developed a robust program that engages in hosting scholars, monitoring and advocacy activities, as well as educational initiatives such as these webinars. Over the last few years, many of us have seen, heard, and perhaps have experienced an increase in attacks to academic freedom. So we want to inform our audience about the relevance and possible applications of the principles that created the Inter-American Commission to the higher education sector, which includes scholars, staff members, and students. Today's session focuses on the Inter-American Principles on Academic Freedom and University Autonomy adopted in 2021. The adoption of such principles is a significant development within the Inter-American human rights system because they seek to safeguard academic communities, reinforce institutional autonomy, and protect the role of universities across the continent. The purpose of this session, then, is to introduce how the principles came to be, explain their content, and illustrate their possible applications for the region. A second webinar session will take place next Monday, February 2nd, at the same time, and we invite you to join us once again if you are available. The link will appear on the chat. Our speakers today are Mr. Pedro Vaca Villarreal. Lovely to have you with us, Pedro. He is the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights since October 6, 2020. He is a Colombian lawyer from Universidad Nacional de Colombia. He has a master's degree in law and a specialization in constitutional law, with more than 12 years of professional experience in the field of human rights. From 2013 to 2020, he served as executive director of the Foundation for Freedom of the Press in Colombia. Our second speaker today is Salvador Herencia Carrasco, our colleague and part-time professor at the Faculty of Law, Civil Law section at the University of Ottawa, and current legal advisor of the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas, which is a joint project with our center, Scholars at Risk, in Universidad de Monterrey in Mexico. Before moving to Canada, Salvador worked as legal advisor to the Andean Commission of Jurists, senior jurisdictional counsel to the Constitutional Court of Peru, and chief human rights legal advisor to the Peruvian Department of Justice and Human Rights. The format for the webinar will consist on having the speakers present between 15 and 20 minutes, and then we will open for questions. We invite you to submit your questions through the Q&A function of the chat so we can manage them all. And if, in case we get too many questions, we can maybe move a few together and ask our speakers to comment on that. So without further delay, Pedro, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Viviana, and it's a pleasure to be with you, Salvador, and thanks for all of you that get connected to this webinar. Good afternoon to everyone joining us. It is a pleasure to be with you today in an unusually cold and snowy day for those of us in the east coast of North America. Let me begin by thanking the Human Rights Research and Education Center and the scholars at risk at the University of Ottawa. Today's webinar is dedicated to introducing and reintroducing the Inter-American Principles on Academic Freedom and University Autonomy, a regional normative framework adopted in 2021 by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, one of the three human rights mechanisms worldwide. To clarify the scope of academic freedom, the obligations of states, and also the responsibilities of academic institutions in the Americas. These principles were developed in response of a growing concern across the hemisphere that talks about the increasing pressure placed on universities, students, professors, and researchers for the content of their teaching, their research, and their participation in the public debate. Around the region, we have documented harassment, stigmatization, political interference, attacks on campuses, budgetary retaliation, censorship, and even acts of violence targeting members of the academic community. These realities underscore why academic freedom is not an abstract concept. It is a concrete right that requires active protection. The objective of this presentation is to provide an accessible overview of what these principles are, why they matter, and how they can be used as a tool to strengthen democratic societies. The starting point of the principles is a simple but powerful recognition, and is that academic freedom is a fundamental right in any given democracy. It is not only a professional privilege of academics, it is a right that enables the exercise of many other rights, including freedom of expression, the right to education, freedom of association and assembly, cultural rights, and the right to benefit from scientific progress. The Commission affirms that knowledge is a public and social good. Universities and academic communities play an essential role as generators of knowledge, spaces of debate, and engines for democratic life. They are often the places where societies confront their most difficult questions about power, inequality, history, science, technology, and our future. When academic freedom is undermined, the damage extends far beyond campus walls. Restrictions on teaching and research weaken the public debate, obstruct scientific progress, and shrink the democratic space itself. This is why the protection of academic freedom is inseparable from the protection of democracy. The Inter-American principles were adopted in response to concrete trends observed across the hemisphere. The Commission has received sustained reports of, for example, repression of student movements and unions, political control of curricula and research agendas, harassment and criminalization of professors and researchers, attacks against campuses, libraries, and laboratories, gender-based violence and discrimination within academic institutions, and budgetary measures used to punish critical universities or universities where there are critical voices. At the same time, technological change, privatization, and securitization are transforming higher education in ways that raise new human rights challenges. The principles seek to respond to these realities by offering a clear regional framework grounded in Inter-American human rights standards and informed by the global academic freedom of expression standards. Their purpose is threefold. First, to clarify what academic freedom and university autonomy mean under human rights law. Second, to define the duties of states and the responsibilities of academic institutions. And third, to provide a tool for courts, policymakers, universities, and civil society to prevent violations and respond when they occur. At the heart of the principles is a broad and inclusive understanding of academic freedom. Academic freedom is defined as the right of every person to seek, generate, and transmit knowledge, and to participate in academic communities to teach, learn, research, debate, publish, and disseminate ideas freely without fear of reprisals. The principles emphasize that academic freedom has both an individual and a collective dimension. Individually, it protects students, professors, researchers, and staff. Collectively, it protects society's right to receive the knowledge and ideas produced within academic life. Crucially, academic freedom is not confined to classrooms and laboratories. It applies inside and outside educational institutions. It protects participation in public debate, engagement with the media, peaceful protests related to academic issues, and criticism of educational systems and institutions. These principles also recognize the importance of diversity in academic life. Diversity of methods, topics, sources, and epistemologies, including the protection of indigenous education systems, languages, and knowledge. In short, academic freedom protects not only what is taught, but also who teaches, how knowledge is produced, and how it circulates in society. A central pillar of the principles is university autonomy. Autonomy is described as an essential prerequisite for academic freedom. Without it, universities cannot fulfill their mission of generating and disseminating knowledge. Autonomy encompasses decision-making over academic, organizational, financial, and personal matters. It protects self-governance, pluralism, and democratic participation within institutions. The principles are very clear that public funding and regulatory powers must never be used as tool of punishment, ideological control, or retaliation. Budgetary manipulation can be as damaging to academic freedom as overt censorship. At the same time, the principles stress that autonomy is not isolation. It carries responsibilities. Universities must operate transparently, guarantee due process, ensure job stability based on fair criteria, and respect the fundamental rights to all members of their communities. Autonomy exists to protect rights, not to shield abuses. The principles devote significant attention to equality and non-discrimination. They affirm that academic freedom must be guaranteed to all persons without discrimination, including on grounds such as political opinion, race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, disability, health status, or socioeconomic condition. They recognize that academic spaces often reproduce structural inequalities present in society. States therefore have a duty not only to refrain from discrimination, but to actively dismantle structural barriers that adopt affirmative measures to ensure equitable access, participation, and professional development. The principles especially call attention to the obstacles faced by women in academia, including gender stereotypes, pay gaps, and exposure to sexual and gender-based violence. Academic freedom cannot exist where fear, exclusion, or inequality determine who is allowed to speak, research, or belong. The principles address two of the most serious threats facing academic freedom today: political interference and violence. First, regarding interference, they establish that any state action affecting academic content, institutional functioning, or educational access must meet strict requirements of legality, legitimate aim, necessity, and proportionality. They warn against indirect forms of control, such as discriminatory accreditation systems, ideological curricula mandates, stigmatizing public discourse by official and retaliatory funding decisions. Second, the principles explicitly recognize attacks against academic communities as grave human rights violations. Threats, harassments, assaults, gender-based violence, killings, and attacks on institutions all undermine academic freedom and generate chilling effects across society. States have a duty to prevent these acts, investigate them, punish those responsible, and provide reparations, applying an intersectional and gender-sensitive approach. The principles also affirm the inviolability of academic spaces. Interventions by security forces must be exceptional and strictly constrained by human rights standards. National security cannot be invoked to suppress academic life. Please, Viviana, tell me when I am getting closer to the time limit. I'm close to end. The principles draw a clear line against censorship. The state unequivocally that, I mean, the principles state that unequivocally, sorry for the pronunciation, that prior censorship on academic research, publications, curricula, or access to knowledge is prohibited. The impositions of taboos over fields of study or topics of inquiry is incompatible with academic freedom. They also stress, and I'm talking about the principles, that criminal law must be an absolute last resort. The use of punitive power against those exercising academic freedom requires the highest level of scrutiny and exceptional justification. At the same time, the principles recognize that academic freedom today is inseparable from the digital environment. They affirm the right to conduct academic activities through digital technologies and call on states to work towards universal internet access to prevent arbitrary restrictions online. They also highlight the role of platforms and intermediaries encouraging transparency, diversity, and dialogue with academic communities. Finally, the principles emphasize that their effectiveness depends on implementation. And I think this kind of webinars and conversations goes into that direction. The duty to give them live lies with states, universities, judicial system, academic authorities, civil society, and the academic community itself. Implementation includes legal reforms, institutional policies, protection mechanisms, and the creation of spaces for inclusive dialogue. The Inter-American Commission adopted these principles with a clear conviction. Without academic freedom, there can be no genuine democracy. Protecting universities means protecting society's capacity to think critically, to innovate, to remember, and to imagine alternative and good futures. We invite all actors to use these principles, and I think the University of Ottawa has been one of the leaders in this duty since the principles were launched. Um, and we also consider that these principles are a guide, a benchmark, and a shield to ensure that no one in the Americas is punished for teaching, researching, questioning, or thinking. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Pedro. Salvador, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Viviana. Muchas gracias, Pedro. Good morning, good afternoon already. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Salvador Herencia, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here. Once again, thanks to my colleagues at the Human Rights Research and Education Center, but also our colleagues at SAR U Ottawa and at SAR Canada for hosting and for being an advocate in advancing academic freedom and university autonomy, not only here at home in Canada, where it is not as cold and as snowy as it might be in Washington, D.C., Pedro, but but also in the Americas. Uh, it is a hard act to follow after what Pedro has just mentioned, but I would just try to focus on perhaps 3 or 4 points regarding the practical impact that the Inter-American principles have had in its almost a little over 4 years since its adoption. First, and I cannot stress this enough, the importance of the principles is that it was part, or the result was part of a participatory process between the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, civil society organizations, states, and academic universities. This was almost a 2-year process between the launch of this idea of principles, okay, until its adoption in December 2021, as Viviana mentioned in the introduction. In this almost 2 years, give or take, there were consultations, seminars, drafts, working meetings to discuss the extent of this principle. So the first lesson here is that this tool reflects the reality of all of the Americas, This is not just a Latin American instrument made by Latin American lawyers or human rights defenders. North America, the Caribbean, Central and South America, all of these organizations and the states participated in the drafting or in the discussions of this document. So in a way, even though our different countries may have different approaches to international law and to international human rights law, this outcome reflects the needs and approaches of the hemisphere, not just a particular sub-region of the Americas. And that is very important to say because in certain geographies, you say, oh, this was not made according to common law standards, or this was not made under a Caribbean lens. And this is not necessarily true in the case of the principles. Secondly, I would like to welcome the adoption of principles in a way that for the last almost 10 years, if I'm not mistaken, the Inter-American Commission have adopted a set of principles which are non-binding legal instruments. This is not a treaty. This is not a convention. In a way to set up, this is our views where human rights field should focus or should advance. So they have done this with academic freedom, but in the past they have done with issues regarding bioethics. They have done this with issues of corruption and climate emergency, among other issues. And in a way, as we have seen in the past 10 years or so, all of these topics are current and relevant now more than ever. The third element that we've had, the importance or the contribution of these principles is that it filled a gap. Up until December 2021, there was no comprehensive international instrument that would understand or define what is academic freedom. What does it mean? How does this relate to other rights? Like, what is this interdependence? We always understood the relation with the specific and important relation between freedom of expression or freedom or free speech and right to education. But what about right to science? What about freedom of assembly? What about gender and racial discrimination? So on and so forth. So that's why it is important to, when you read the Inter-American Principles, it says that academic freedom has an habilitating nature for the enjoyment and fulfillment of other rights. So this is an element that is important for us to understand that, or for us to take into account when we are advocating issues regarding academic freedom or we are litigating cases, that this is a tool that may be of use and importance. And a final element on this introduction is that I've mentioned that this is a soft law instrument. This is not a treaty. This is not a legally binding document, but it has teeth. And we have seen in the past 4 years, and I will talk about some of these cases very briefly, about the impact that this instrument has had. And in a way, the fact that it's called soft law or be named soft law, it does not mean that it does not have teeth. And if are any of you here uh, familiar with Latin American history or Latin American and international law, you will see that transitional justice and the right to truth, it started like this, as a soft law recognition, and now it is a cornerstone not only of transitional justice processes in the Americas, but throughout the world. For anybody here from Colombia, know that the Colombian transitional process has the element of right to truth as a cornerstone of its own system. So let's not, my message here would be not to undermine the importance and the gravitas that this instrument has just because it is a set of principles. Advancing, or what has happened since December 2021, and from here I will take the liberty to speak of the cases that within the Human Rights Research and Education Center, but also of the Coalition of Academic Freedom in the Americas has had or has supported in the past 4 or 5 years. We have seen that these principles have been used to try to stop the political control of universities and research grants. The main examples that we have seen could be in Mexico and Argentina. I am not saying that these were completely successful, but by filling this void of having inter-American principles, academics, scientific communities had a tool and have used this tool as a means to stop a political and hostile takeover of research grants, universities, and control of public universities. Perhaps the best example that we have seen could be in Brazil, the Bolsonaro government, where states or where the federal government attempted to politically control and prosecute public university professors for having views that were contrarian to the official government policies, whether it was the COVID pandemic, among other climate change, deforestation in the Amazon, among other issues. So these principles used with other rights that are enshrined in the American Convention of Human Rights, but also other international instruments, have been used to stop or to try to deter governments from abusing their power, attacking higher education institutions. A second element that also Pedro had already mentioned in his presentation is the recognition that academic freedom goes beyond a right or a privilege by university professors, but encompasses or includes the entire university community. And this is of a specific importance as it has a section or has sections related to the right and protections of university students. Once again, we go back to history to understand the importance of this. This is not just about uh, dictatorships and military regimes in Nicaragua or Venezuela persecuting students and or trying to shut down university associations. This goes back to pretty much how, even since the late 20th centuries, university associations and university students were at the forefront claiming or protesting for democratic change in the Americas. Whether you're talking about Mexico in the 70s, Peru in the 90s, Argentina in the 80s, Uruguay in the 80s, and pretty much every other continent, every other country in Latin America, we have seen university students as targeted, harassed, and attacked because they were opposing anti-democratic policies or pretty much military dictatorships. So the recognition of their university of the academic freedom covering student organizations is not only thinking about the future and the role that students have in pursuing their academic or their career, but also recognizing the role that student associations and university students have had in the consolidation of democracy in Latin America, as precarious as it may be. And in this way, it also speaks to the importance of institutional autonomy. If you were to examine or do a comparative examine of Latin American constitutions, the recognition of academic freedom can be found on specific constitutions in Brazil, in Ecuador, to name just a few examples. But university autonomy is pretty much embedded in every single Latin American constitution. And again, is thinking about the dictatorships and military regimes of the past, and to see universities, as Pedro and Viviana have said, as in a way a cradle or a space of free thinking, of free exchange of ideas, and a place where democracy should always be fed and should be used as an example. A third element that I would like to recognize also is the importance of recognizing or linking academic freedom to the right to science. As many of you know, Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights speaks about the element of science as a public good, of science and for society to benefit from the progress of scientific progress. In this case, the Inter-American principles bring or take that recognition of the ICSCR into account, but also establishes almost a three-level or three-tier recognition or role of the right to science. First, an individual right for persons to individually pursue their scientific research. Secondly, the role of the universities to create programs that enable this condition or this pursuit of science. And thirdly, the role of society as a whole, or to actually benefit from this element. And this is not just legal poetry. It has significant implications. We go once again to Brazil, where under the Bolsonaro government, they shut down the monitoring program regarding the deforestation process of the Amazon, And that data, which is valuable not only for environmental purposes, but for the protection of indigenous peoples, but for the element of climate change, is an important information for society as a whole. It is not surprising that with the change of government, there were claims and valid claims that one of the an indigenous peoples in Brazil during the Bolsonaro government, because of these policies, were victims of genocide. And this is a process that is right now before Brazilian federal courts. So this is the importance of the link to science and academic freedom, that it goes beyond a specific research grant or goes beyond a specific research topic. It has implications not only policy-wise, but also as a human rights scope. And finally, Viviana, to start concluding my presentation, to be respectful of people's time, another element that is important that I think it is important is to how these principles can be used to put a human right lens on issues that are not necessarily seen as a human right issue. For example, labor contracts and labor disputes. We have been working and supporting cases in Ecuador, in Colombia, and in a case related to Cuba, where professors and academics were dismissed or were fired, but they were fired because the university authorities were not happy or were not pleased with the approach of their research. And the research in most cases were advancing, in the cases that we have dealt with, were advancing gender rights, advancing gender studies, or allocating a research grant or a scholarship to a transgender student. And because of these decisions were seen as complex and problematic, these professors were fired. So what has been a labor dispute for the most part, it is also a human right element because they're being breached and they're being silenced for politically based reasons. So these are issues that in fact, tomorrow there is a hearing in a court in Ecuador where this professor was fired, where a professor was fired, a feminist scholar was fired because of her views and because of her teaching and because the right-wing government that is right now in Ecuador does not like gender studies or does not like the issue of gender. So in order to receive funds, they had to minimize almost completely the current study programs. These are just some of the examples of the potential use of the Inter-American principles. For us, working at the Human Rights Research and Education Center and also with the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas, these topics or the Inter-American principles have not only served as a fill in the gap, but has allowed us to understand or to put a human right lens to something that was almostly used as a privilege of certain people within the academic world. Because depending on the country, this academic freedom does not cover even part-time professors, only tenure professors. Again, it depends on the province, it depends on the country, it depends on the jurisdiction. But if one is covered and if not everybody is covered, then the problem that we see is that there are abuses that may affect students, abuses that may happen to professors, and also administrators. The most important element that we've had to deal, and this again speaking from our experience, has been gender-based violence within the university space. If the university cannot stop women, cannot stop or cannot make a safe environment for women, where women, and whether they are students, whether they are academics or the administrative staff, whether they are afraid to leave at night, where they are afraid to meet a professor after hours or even late in the evening, then our universities are failing. So I think that the academic principles, specifically principles 1 and 5, are putting light on the duties of universities to create safe spaces. And there are, to my understanding, a dozen of cases that are being litigated right now in different jurisdictions focusing on this. So we talk about democracy, we talk about the importance of rule of law and human rights. I think that the Inter-American principles ground the role of universities that can actually contribute to improve not only academic life, but also benefit society as a whole. And with this, Viviana, I will conclude for now, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Salvador and Pedro. Definitely lots to think about. And we invite our participants to add questions to the chat. I will convey one opinion from a colleague from Iran who is now in North America. And inspired by the Inter-American Declaration, he says he's exploring the possibility of drafting a Middle East Asia-focused statement on academic freedom and university autonomy. And he's asking if there are counterparts we can point to. So I will invite Mr. Masoud Nouri to perhaps join us next week if he's available, because in that session we will talk about the global principle on academic freedom, which was developed with the help of Scholars at Risk. And so the point of that was really to bring an instrument that could be used and applied to all jurisdictions. So there will be other colleagues who will participate in that session, but definitely something to look forward to. If you're unavailable, please write me, and I will be able to send you the reference. And just one moment. The other thing is to mention that like the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas, which we are a part of as a center, and there is a coalition in Africa and a coalition in Southeast Asia. And so there are definitely colleagues working in these topics, and I would be glad also to share their contacts with. So thank you so much for that question. While I wait to hear from other colleagues in the audience who would like to ask something, I will take my privilege as a moderator to ask Pedro a question about the adoption of the principles and perhaps the role of his office in developing measures that would have been followed since the adoption to monitor attacks on academic freedom and university autonomy. So how has that worked? And if there are any situations or country situations or some university examples that you can share with us that stand out in your mind.
Thank you, Viviana. I would say that there are three factors that were key or that are key in my view. I had the privilege and also the responsibility to be part of the drafting team of the principles at that time, and also the inputs from academic institutions, including the University of Ottawa, was very significant and valuable. But these three factors are the people, the process, and the reality. So the people, it's undeniable to recognize 4 or 5 years later the role of former Commissioner Claudia Piovesan with a strong academic background, a true believer of academic freedom. She was a great and very important actor to stimulate the conversation on academic freedom at that time. As you know, the commission, it's a plenary of 7 members that do have 4-year mandate. So it happened all, I mean, at the end of her mandate. So it was, I mean, she encouraged us and she called the academic community to contribute. And I think that what we have today as Inter-American Principles for Academic Freedom, it's part of her legacy. And that's important. It's important to have in multilateralism people in power that take the responsibility to stimulate these conversations. The second point, the second factor, I think, is the process. I think that at the Inter-American system, we have, I wouldn't say unique, but probably it's a very strengthened experience on conversations around human rights and reality. So these principles do not come in a void. No, it comes after several months, I would say years, documenting that the sphere of academic activities was shrinked. And the main question is, does it have is an exception or is a pattern? No? Because at the early
Mhm.
beginnings, we were having just, I mean, separated cases, but it has become something that is repeated, an attitude, and also the process of multilateralism, because I mean, I'm in charge of the Office of the Special Rapporteur that advises the Commission, that also it's a principal body of the OAS, the Organization of American States. And I think those are different layers of the conversation. So the link between these conversations and multilateralism is important. I just read in the Q&A chat that uh, this could be, I mean, something that is seen in other regions. But in my experience, the role of I mean, the model of multilateralism specialized in human rights that also uh, um, do debate in the political sphere, I think it's important. And and third, I think that the reality shows us that it's not only academic freedom. Is what is right in the middle is the promise of uh, have different views of our own reality. Um, the dilemma between imposing views and debating and with good arguments win the discussion, no? So I mean, I've been working for quite a few years on free expression, and when I try to analyze the through the eyes of the censor, what I see is fear. And what I see is that censorship becomes a shortcut to avoid the conversation. So academic institutions are thought and have played a role of temples of knowledge. So what it's in the middle is we have to protect, we have to expand those temples, not to uh, target them. And target them is not only like the buildings, it's the people that works there, that go there for improving the knowledge, for contributing from different experiences and perspectives. I think that we should take this seriously because at that time, 2021, if I'm not mistaken, uh, we we wanted the principles to prevent. Uh, I, I keep thinking that principles do play a role of prevention, but in a way, I think that some of the facts and reports we're seeing in across the Americas also show that probably the ones that stimulate that conversation, including Commissioner Flavia, were not wrong, and that these principles are, I mean, should play a role in the conversation about knowledge and about interchange of ideas.
Thank you, Pedro. Salvador, would you like to add anything in that regard?
Yeah, but just before that, I would like to just go back to Sayed's question about this process. Uh, so in May 2024, okay, uh, the current UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Education adopted a report on academic freedom. And this was just 3 years after the former UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, adopted also a report on academic freedom, uh, of course, under different angles. But in the case of this May 2024 report, there is an annex to it. And I know that Robert Quinn, who is director of the Scholars at Risk, who is joining us here in the audience, would, send me a furious email if I weren't to mention this. But there is an annex here that has a global tools for implementing the right to academic freedom. So Sayed, and I will post in a bit in the chat the link to these principles that you can see, and you can see how to implement academic freedom is being taken to a global level, at least in an attempt at a global level, but also building on many of the work and lessons regarding that were adopted or discussed at the Inter-American Principles or Inter-American Principles. So the wonderful thing here is that whether we're talking about regional systems or not, there are elements that feed into each other, and that's perhaps a contribution from the different system feeding into a need to advance this right to academic freedom. And from the cases, I see that one of the cases was, if there are practical cases, there is a case against Nicaragua, which is a case. It's a labor dispute again, labor unions of a university. That is a current case that is being discussed right now, that is sitting at the court. But there are other cases within the Inter-American Commission uh, regarding discrimination and termination of contracts of some professors. These are on the very initial stages, right? So this will still take quite a while. A long while for them to actually make it to the court. But historically, for example, one of the most important cases in the history of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is the case of La Cantuta versus Peru. La Cantuta is along with Barrios Altos, or one of the leading cases of international criminal law, international criminal justice, transitional justice, so on and so forth. This case was about the kidnap and extrajudicial execution of university professors and students, because these were all members of the University of La Cantuta that happened under the Fujimori regime. And if you were to see the cases of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, there are a lot of cases where academic freedom was at the heart of the discussion or of the rights breach. But because there was a gap or a lack of instruments to guide what are we supposed to understand academic freedom, these cases were completely dismissed or were addressed as a human right violations, a forced disappearance, torture, and so on and so forth. But there are cases that there was academic freedom element to it, and perhaps the best example of it would be the latest advisory opinion on climate emergency and human rights that I will gladly respond if you ask a question about
Thank you. So let's go to other questions, and some of the questions submitted have been addressed in some parts. So Mr. Gustavo Cetrini is asking about context where there are not even the prerequisites for academic freedom that are available. So universities and higher education institutions where that have historically always operated with high levels of political control and low capacity for intellectual production. So what happens there? What can be done? How could we assist with the principles in some cases? And we can see this in cases like Cuba, por ejemplo, which have been, we have been discussing for a long time and that are center monitored for a few years as well. So any comments on such environments and what could be conceivable to do? Either Pedro or Salvador.
Yeah, I can try to react to that, and also to a couple of other questions are in the Q&A chat. One of the, I would say, beautiful things that the global conversation of human rights implies is that regardless the democratic or autocratic or model of regime, most of these countries do belong to multilateralism. So I would put it in this way. We, the ones that drafted and believe in these principles, we think that we have good reasons to spread it, to ask member states to fulfill the requirements, to guide policy making, to inspire. I mean, we think we have good arguments to support that, and to expose those regimes that deny, that reject, in contrast to these kind of principles, I think it's itself a denounce. So I'm totally aware, and for those curious, you can go, for example, to the annual report of my office, in 2024 is the one that is published most recently. And you go to different chapters of, I mean, country-based chapters. It's a long report. You'll see that academic freedom restrictions are placed there. So I think it helps. It's not going to solve all the pillars of authoritarian regimes, but for sure it's a way to denounce, to contrast, and also to ask for a better argument on the other side. I mean, if universities become or have been propaganda machines, then we do believe in universities as areas and spaces for improvement of knowledge, for gathering the best evidence and guide our future through that. I mean, the pandemic was that. I mean, we all came experienced that, and we all can say that the evidence-based knowledge is the one that should be treated in that hierarchy. And I'll go to another question about the interaction between the principles and the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court. So those are different mechanisms, but what I can say is that the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court was taken into account for drafting the principles. There's a huge portion on criminal law and criminalization of academic communities. And if we go to the footnotes or the sources, we go to the well-developed tension between criminal law and free expression from the Inter-American system and the Inter-American Court ruling. So I think that we are trying to fertilize the conversation. We are also open to receive counter arguments, but what we cannot tolerate is the use of power to block the methodologies and the existence itself of academic communities. And also something, and I will wrap up with this idea, that is not possible to monitor. So when we document a threat against a journalist or a professor, that's a fact that it can be described. But how do we document self-censorship? How do we document fear? How do we document the sense of non-confidence to say something in the middle of a classroom, or to dress in a way that could be understood as an aggression? So I think we have to be careful with this, because self-censorship is an atmosphere, and it's an atmosphere that is very hard to tackle. When silence and fear rules, the final punish is the whole society. And I think that's where we want to root this conversation, and we are very open to keep discussing it.
Thank you, Pedro. Salvador, some comments and maybe addressing some of the questions on the chat that are remaining.
Yes, I will try to respond what Jack and Karina have mentioned, just because I cannot I cannot go beyond what Pedro has said. I just say yes, I agree with everything that he has said. Well, Jack, I would like to, well, first of all, how to work in different regional uh, principles. First of all, Jack Meyerhofer is a colleague and a dear friend of Scholars at Risk. I would recommend everybody to contact you, first of all, because you have a better answers than myself on how to do that. But secondly, I think that we were working about setting a set of principles, a set of norms. And I've seen this in different fields. We're always thinking, oh, maybe X, Y, or Z, whether that's a country, a government, or a person, is not going to like it. And we are limiting ourselves. We're creating our basement before we even start negotiations. And especially in the context that we're currently working on, we should actually strive, at least that our first draft, our negotiation should be, how can we discuss the greatest protection possible? If we are afraid to work, oh, should not put gender-based violence because there are conservative governments that might not like it. If they don't like it, that's their problem, not our problem. You cannot ignore the importance of of fighting against gender-based violence. You cannot discuss gender discrimination for sexual orientation. You cannot deny that it is a human right violation to deny a scholarship just because that person is a trans student, right? So if we can't agree on these very basic element, we can then discuss the nuances of the different elements. And I think that if there's something that different regions of the world, let's call it the global South, Africa, the Southeast Asia, Latin America, is the collaboration among each other. So a South-South collaboration, regardless of what Prime Minister Carney said last week at Davos, should be a reality. And it is something that is already happening, and we should explore, all of us, how to advance inter-American regional standards, feeding also on what the UN has said about that. As secondly, Karina, we are aware of the discussions in Paraguay, but not only in Paraguay, but also in other countries in the region. As you know, there are no rights that are absolute. So no academic freedom, no university autonomy could authorize hate speech, denialism of human rights violations, of dictatorship. So again, the fact that Pedro's office led the drafting of the Inter-American freedom, the Inter-American principles on academic freedom, the element, the proportionality test, the test to know if its speech is grounded or not within international law or constitutional norm, is actually applicable to this case. To deny the existence of a dictatorship in Paraguay, whether it's Stroessner or any other place, like in Chile, as it will happen in the incoming months, these are not grounded on academic freedom, and this is an abuse of freedom of speech, but also abuse of academic freedom. There is no place. Autonomy does not mean a free for all. There's no absolute right, and I think that these constitutional and international tools would apply to cases like the one that you've mentioned.
Thank you both. So yeah, the example of Paraguay is being cited again in one of the questions, but we can leave that for another occasion, perhaps. And we are coming to the end, unfortunately. This was just a short session. Again, I reiterate the invitation to join us next Monday at noon Eastern Time to talk about instruments instruments like the global principles on academic freedom and the views of the International Science Council about what is happening in other jurisdictions and how we can use those tools to combat attacks to academic freedom. Perhaps invite Pedro and Salvador to share with us one last reflection before we close. Pedro.
I think that we do have some kind of structures to drive this conversation. I think there's also a generational responsibility because most of the people that lead or do have responsibility positions in academic institutions have had the privilege and have had the experience of being part of a free academic environment, or at least in some democratic countries. And when that is at risk, I think also the people in charge, the leaders of academic institutions, should also spread and share at least the minimum free space that they experienced. And sometimes it implies tough conversations. Sometimes it implies, confronting difficult scenarios. But as free expression believers, to controvert, to react, and to provide a based evidence or best evidence approach, is strong enough. So I think we should not be fearing the conversation. We have to be part of it.
Thank you, Salvador.
Well, I would just like to conclude, first of all, thanking all of our partners and colleagues that have been supporting and working with us for the past, 7, 8 years on academic freedom, and invite all of you to join the networks, whether it's SAR U Ottawa, SAR Canada, the Coalition for Academic Freedom, and Scholars at Risk. We're open. We're a small group of team, but fierce and mighty. and we are always welcome to collaborate, as we have been collaborating with the Inter-American Commission and other offices. So it's just be an invitation to for us to alliances makes, teamwork makes the dream work. So that would be my final message.
Thank you so much. So again, thank you to all the participants for their insightful questions. And there is a ton more to share. The invitation for next week. Thank you very much to Pedro to join us today, and to Salvador to share their experiences and insights. So wishing you a lovely afternoon, and we'll see you soon in another platform.